Hello and welcome. My name is Alan Gregg. I'm one of 38 principals in the Earnscliffe Strategy Group. Those of you who may not be familiar with our firm, we're a public affairs strategy company that has subject matter expertise in government relations, strategic communications, and public opinion research. I'd also like to apologize for my appearance. Normally I'm fastidiously well groomed, but after 3 weeks at home, this is what you get. That's a cautionary tale. My fellow panelists, however, don't have the same kind of hygiene problems, and they're here to talk about the crisis in the Canadian oil industry. Let me introduce them to you. First, Kaveri Braid. She is our managing principal out of Saskatchewan, former journalist. Rick Anderson, the principal, works out of both British Columbia and Ottawa. I'll come to our guest panelist in 1 second. Sarah Goldfeder, she is a former diplomat and expert in Canada-US relations, works out of our Ottawa office. And Malti Solberg, who many of Albertans would know as former cabinet minister, is now a principal in New West Public Affairs. And our special guest is Marla Orenstein, who is the director of the National Resource Centre at the Canada West Foundation. We got about an hour. We want to talk about how we got to where we got to in this sector, what kind of global dynamics are at work right now affecting the sector. What is it that Alberta needs, and the oil industry needs in order to weather this at least midterm storm? And we'll spend most of our time on what are the likely government responses given those problems, and what will be the implications flowing out of those responses. But before we get there, I want to start with you, Kaveri, because the whole kind of strategy that we've been following in this COVID-19, the kind of the bend the curve or plank the curve or flatten the curve, was to ensure that our healthcare system was not overwhelmed. How are the prairies coping right now at the healthcare level?
You know, Alan, overall, I think the Western provinces right now so far are looking good in terms of cases of COVID-19. I think most provinces out west are now reporting more recoveries than positive tests. But I also don't want to paint the picture that it's all sunshine and roses out here. There are still many cases throughout senior care homes and correctional facilities that are still quite concerning. But in terms of healthcare capacity, I think Western regional hospitals so far seem to be handling the pandemic. In the last week itself, we've seen the number of people hospitalized or admitted into ICUs actually drop. So I think it's fair to say that there is cautious optimism out west.
Marla, I want to start the subject matter here with you and get some sense of what's happening on the ground. And what kind of impact has this crisis had, the current crisis, the coronavirus crisis, had on responsible energy development in the field?
Good question. Thank you, Alan. I think that it's actually created a sort of an interesting paradox. On the one hand, I think that there's likely to be an amplification of the push for responsibility in energy production. And partly this is coming from the public. There's a value shift happening. And I think that the COVID pandemic is causing many people to reevaluate and take a hard look at what they want from their own lives and what they want from society in general. Also, the COVID emergency has shown governments to an extent what some of the things are that they can actually do to act in ways that they might not have previously thought possible if they feel that there's real urgency to an issue. And these two things, this public sentiment and government's increased ability to act, may drive towards an acceleration of a responsible energy transition. But the paradox part is that this is coming at a time now with these historical low oil prices, meaning that there's less of an ability for the oil industry to actually invest in those changes.
Monty, just further to that, what is the financial health of the industry right now? I mean, what's happening in terms of production, in terms of capital markets and investments?
Well, it's a complete disaster, Alan. Let me just say, when it comes to unemployment is shooting through the roof. There was a story the other day about Banff having 85% unemployment because, of course, it's a service town and everything's closed up. It's a complete disaster. But there is no capital coming in to Alberta. Capital investment's been falling for the last 6 years or so. And this year it'll drop off even more. Exploration budgets have been cut. Drillers are sitting idle. Production companies have have cut staffing. Small towns are feeling the pain. It's a real mess, and the only answer in the short run is some liquidity. These companies need cash.
We're going to get to that for sure, but Rick, you've made the point on a number of instances that this is the one sector that isn't looking for just a bridge back to the pre-COVID period. That the forces that are crippling the sector are multiple. Give us a sense of both the domestic and the global factors that are at work here.
Well, it's very complex, and it's a complete perfect storm of mostly bad news. I mean, the one piece of good news, if you're in the oil business, is that demand has continued to grow over each year. It's a pretty reliable market, growing by about 1% a year, which means about 100 million barrels a day is what the volume was when we entered the pandemic, on track to be 101 million barrels this year, and so on. That's the only actual good news that there is in terms of the macro side of it. As Monty just mentioned, about 6 years ago, in 2014, there was a huge price shock, which had been brewing for a while because production is increasing in the United States and in Canada and in Russia and in Saudi Arabia and lots of producers around the world. So there's a lot of capacity to produce oil there that has been depressing prices for the last 6 years. In Canada, of course, we know that production capacity has outstripped our ability to ship the stuff easily because our pipeline construction has fallen behind the industry's needs, thanks to, depending on whose view of it you want to listen to, regulatory sclerosis. It takes too long to get projects done, or they get canceled even after they've been approved, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of politics and all of that. Plus a very broken Indigenous relationship as regards some of these major projects, which, it's hard to remember now because of everything that's going on more recently. But, 2 months ago, talking about not wanting to go back to where we were, the trains weren't running across Canada because of protests against, in that case, a gas project. So that was where we were. And then what happened in the same week, if you can believe it, in March, is WHO declared the coronavirus a global pandemic, and it's triggered all kinds of things we're now living with every single day, including cratered demand. And in the same week, Russia and Saudi Arabia escalated their price war, their market share war, and cratered the price even further. So now we're seeing cratering demand because of, stay-home orders from most Western governors.
Is that as large as 30%, as some estimate, do you think?
It's just some parts of the sector are larger than that. I mean, gasoline sales are down by more than 60, 70%. Nobody's driving to work.
Right.
Except essential workers. The planes are not flying. I think the airline capacity is at 15 or 20% right now of what it was. And that's a fairly big chunk of energy consumption, of fuel energy consumption. So you've really had some major things happen. You've got cratering demand now because of the coronavirus. You've got escalated production. The OPEC agreement isn't really affecting that very much. It's affecting prices. And now you've got something that we've never really seen before, which is the world's ability to store oil is reaching its maximum capacity. So
there's no place to put the oversupply.
There's no place to put it. I mean, it's not like producing a car that if it doesn't get sold, it goes onto an inventory lot somewhere, or another product that goes into a warehouse. You can't ship oil if nobody's taking it at the other end of the pipe. And so we're starting to see now in North America and around the world shut-in production that's not a function of no demand, but a function of no place to put it.
Sarah, I mean, when we think about these constraints on the industry, we often think, as Rick has identified, domestic regulatory issues, indigenous issues, or global issues, OPEC, Saudi Arabia, Russia, price war. How much does what's happening within the continental energy markets, more specifically the fact that literally for the first time in history, America has the capability of more production than they actually need, contribute to the woes of the Canadian industry?
Well, I think it's important to note that not all oil is equal to each other, right? So, I mean, there's various types of oil that we're talking about. When we talk about what has been increased in the United States production versus what Canada supplies, they're slightly different. And so I think it is important to remember that, you know, the world needs a mix of all of these different kinds of oil and petroleum products. And so I think it wouldn't be fair to say that the United States production and the United States domestic production would necessarily impact Canadian domestic production. I think what's more important is that the politics behind it are really what kind of comes into play.
Expand on that.
Yeah, we're at this moment in time though where I think we have a North American demand that is, you know, that pretty much can be met with North American supply. Now, can that be met across all different kinds of various petroleum needs? I'm not sure. And I think that that's something that we have yet to really to determine in many different ways. But the reality is that we have a government in the United States that would like to have domestic supply for everything that it needs. It would like to make America fully self-sufficient. And so the role for Canada in this is going to be increasingly hard to eke out. But at the same time, you know, there is a shared border and there's really a shared industry, because the fact is that, you know, Canadian production goes to the United States to be refined. And so in many ways it is American oil. And so when it actually finally gets to a consumable state, it has been through both countries. And so it's really one North American market. And I think that that's what will keep it kind of steady moving forward and will eclipse some of the political concerns.
I want to get to that more, the whole prospect of the North American market. But first, Monty, you're in touch with the Alberta government all the time. I mean, what are their major asks right now? What are they looking for? And I guess a supplementary question to that, given what we've heard, is there a public policy, a domestic public policy response that's actually going to make any difference, given the multiple impacts that we're seeing that are beyond our borders as well?
So a lot of great companies in Alberta right now are struggling to find financing to, you know, carry out the normal sort of course of business that they would normally undertake. So even good companies that have great, you know, relatively great balance sheets can't find financing. What they really need is liquidity. You know, banks look around and see the constrained pipelines, the regulatory uncertainty, the falling demand. It's just a real nightmare. So what they're looking for, and what the Alberta government is helping with, is they're pressuring Ottawa for liquidity, some kind of a liquidity package that allows them to finance their normal operations. And in some cases, you know, there'll be companies looking to expand at some point when some of the weaker companies don't make it.
A lot of the traditional lenders, I mean, are not providing that kind of liquidity because they don't think that the sector or parts of the sector are financially viable. I mean, is it realistic for government to step in there?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me just say that even recently, some of the biggest companies in North America have gone out to raise cash just because they were looking ahead and could see, you know, how long this could possibly last. If you're a smaller company, you don't have that as an option. So, I mean, this is absolutely critical right now for the industry to survive. And Premier Kenney, I know, has been working with Minister Freeland and others in the federal government to try and get a package that is effective on the one hand, but on the other hand, and I think everyone's conscious of this, doesn't allow companies that wouldn't make it anyway to hang on and somehow survive this.
Picking winners and losers?
Well, it's difficult. You know, we'll see what happens when they bring it out. But they're really trying to avoid, I think, picking winners and losers, and they'd like to see this be a bit Darwinian, as I understand it. And the guys that were going, you know, on a good path already would continue on.
I want to throw this to the whole group because you know, Finance Minister Marneau now famously has said we will have a relief package to the oil and gas industry within days, if not hours. That was 3 weeks ago. What's happening? What's the holdup here? What's the points of contention? What kind of dynamic is going on in the federal cabinet right now that's preventing this package from coming forward? Rick, you want to start there? You're on mute, Rick.
Still mute.
Sorry. Oil has become, as we all know here, one of the most politicized commodities on the planet. You know, we see it all the time. We saw it all the time in Canada before we got into this crisis, and it hasn't gone away. So there are people who shy away from wanting to offer anything that feels like support, let alone bailouts for the oil and gas industry, and who think, you know, we should find other ways to put our money. There are people who understand other places to put our money. There are people who understand that oil is Canada's biggest export, responsible for, you know, in normal times, 120 billion dollars a year of foreign export earnings.
4% of GDP or something. It's huge.
Yeah, 800,000 jobs, indirectly across the country. You know, I mean, we talk about equalization and what we use equalization for across the country. The input to equalization is indirectly oil exports. So this is an important part of our economy, directly in Alberta, directly in the industry, indirectly right across the country, and to our political and economic structure. So, you know, there's a lot of pieces to this. So there's advocates for oil. There's people who say, well, we need to be making an energy transition. You know, the energy industry, the oil and gas industry, have responded to that by adopting, you know, very expensive R&D measures to reduce their emissions. Most of the big players in the industry have adopted the goal of net carbon zero by 2050. So the industry feels like it's doing its part to be part of the energy transformation towards a cleaner oil and gas industry as part of a changing mix of you know, oil, gas, electricity, renewables, et cetera, across the country. So you're seeing some of that. The federal government is, I think, hoping that the money that's put into the economic recovery part of this not only supports economic recovery and the retention and growth of jobs, but helps us emerge with a more competitive economy. That's part of, you know, the smart consolidation that's probably necessary for the oil sector, but also a cleaner energy overall. So, you know, the sweet spot for everybody is going to be balancing those things and not having them clash with each other.
What are you hearing, Sarah? You hear any?
Yeah, well, I kind of want to back it up just a little bit, because I think it's important that we understand that this is one piece of the economic recovery package that they're considering federally here in Ottawa.
Right.
And so I think there's been a few different pieces of this along the line that have held them up or slowed them down more than they were anticipating.
Yeah, there's no
So
airline
I think, you know,
package, there's no hospitality sector package yet either, so it's not only
and
energy.
I mean, and you all of a sudden you find sectors like the agriculture sector under certain types of stress, and the agriculture sector really needs to deliver and be able to deliver right now. So you have all of these different sectors clamoring for attention. You also have, you know, kind of a philosophical bent on, do you provide programs that are going to support workers versus do you provide programs that are going to support businesses? How do you ensure that at the end of the day, you haven't left anybody behind? And then I think there's a second conversation that we haven't quite had yet in Canada, which is you know, at what point will we acknowledge that there will be some big companies, many small companies, and many more mom and pops that will be left behind? And how do we restructure the economy moving forward? So all of these pieces are being discussed within cabinet. All of these pieces are being discussed within the broader economic stimulus package that they're trying to come up with. So the fact that it's taking them longer than they initially thought shouldn't really be that big of a surprise.
So you don't think this is an energy specific debate they're having? You think this is a larger debate around how government should be supporting the industries and the sectors that have been hit the hardest by the coronavirus?
I have no doubt that there is a piece of it that's specific to the industry, but I think that conversation is one part of the conversation, and there's a larger set of conversations that are happening on how do we support people versus businesses, how do we ensure that we have a foundation for a diverse economy moving forward, so that when we come out on the other side of this crisis, we find we have something that will be successful over, you know, not just the next 6 months or a year and a half, but the next, you know, decades and generations.
Marla, do you and your colleagues at the Canada West Foundation have any insight on this? Do you hear anything about what's going on in Ottawa? Oh, now you're on mute, Marla.
I am. I suspect you have your ears to the ground, Sarah, a lot more closely we do being positioned there in Ottawa, but certainly those are similar to the discussions that we've had in the office around the balance that has to be created between supporting individuals versus supporting businesses. And all this has crashed down so fast that I know everybody would like something to be coming out in hours or days. But the reality is it's going to be incredibly tricky to put forward, and getting it wrong has large consequences as well.
Monty, you got anything further to add?
Well, I could tell you that there are producers that are already going down. There are drilling companies that are just on the brink. So, it does need to happen quickly. And I think it's very hard to separate supporting, when it comes to oil and gas, certainly supporting workers over companies because some of these companies are so close to the line. Without them, there won't be jobs going into the future.
Kaviri, the provincial government in Saskatchewan just offered its own relief package to the oil industry. Give us a sense of what was in it, and as I asked Monty earlier, is there enough in there to actually make any difference to the sector?
Yeah. Earlier this week, the Saskatchewan government announced a few low-cost provincial support measures to the industry. A lot that was implemented was largely, I would like to say, administrative changes, such as extensions to filing deadlines and to mineral rights that were already scheduled to expire anyways. The only measure with a price tag to it was a 50% reduction to administrative levies paid by producers. And unfortunately, Alan, these measures are going to be very minimal. It has been reported that, producers definitely appreciate the gesture by the provincial government at this time to do something. I think they're very cognizant that oil and gas is, one of the many natural resource sectors in Saskatchewan. We've got other big players in potash and uranium, which the government has to pay attention to. So they definitely appreciate the gesture. But at this time, it's going to have a very minimal effect to the local industry here.
Well, speaking of gestures that have had a minimal impact, to great fanfare, OPEC Plus, OPEC and the G20, announced $10 million barrel reduction of production, the largest ever in history, and nothing happened to the price. In fact, I think today it was under $20. What's going on there, Rick? Why did that have no impact?
Well, two reasons, Alan. One is that is the usual way around OPEC. What's become the typical way around OPEC is that when they announce these cuts, they're dealing with some theoretical production limits that are often not what people are actually producing. And so, the Saudis come in with a number and they say, well, we're going to cut production from this, but they're actually not producing that number. They're producing something else. And the net cut from what's being produced is not nearly as great as the number you quote.
So there's some jiggery pokery going on with the math.
There is. And if
or
you
suspected jiggery pokery.
If you combine what OPEC and the non-OPEC members were talking about cutting on the weekend or on Monday, it was over 14 million barrels a day. Nobody's expecting actual cuts in that of that magnitude, or the markets are not expecting cuts of that magnitude. So, not by dint of OPEC decisions, and so they discounted that. But the other thing that's going on, and it's probably just as important, maybe even more so, is that they're talking about cutting from normal production levels into a market that's gone down by 20 or 30%, as we were talking about earlier.
Well, they cut 10%, and they're still short of having a balance.
Yeah, they haven't. They're not. The idea of the cartel, managing prices is by essentially creating almost shortages, or sometimes shortages that drive up demand and drive up prices, or don't drive up prices, but drive up competition for the product and drive up prices on the way by. That's not happening today. There's all kinds of oil, like we were talking about, it's sitting in storage tanks not being used. So how can they should never have started the price war
what were they thinking? Was that a coincidence that happened right at coronavirus, or?
Well, it was the week of March 8th, I think, March 11th, that the pandemic was, was the emergency turned into a pandemic officially. And it was the Monday of that week that Russia and the Saudis started their price war. So yes, a coincidence, although the pandemic had been, of course, gathering steam since back in January. It was declared a global emergency on January the 30th. So it's not like people didn't know this was happening. But I don't think anybody expected that by April what is this, the 16th of April, we would be sitting all in our homes, talking to all of our clients and friends out there who are in their homes, because we've all been told by all our governments to stay home.
I should have mentioned earlier, right off the top, that we have a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and that people who are listening in are welcome to put any question to the entire panel or to any individual member of the panel. Kaviri's given us a hand here monitoring those. I don't know if you've seen anything yet, Kaviri, that given that I didn't tell people I could do this, that we might want to put to the panel at this point.
Yeah, a few. We've got one question here from a viewer. Does or could the current crisis create an opportunity to seek increased domestic upgrading capacity?
Anyone want to feel that?
Well, I'll jump in on that.
Sure.
No, there's no question that companies that are able to upgrade what they produce in some way, shape, or form are getting a much better price. Right now, for instance, if you are upgrading out of Canada, like Syncrude is doing, and I should declare that they're a client, you're getting close to the world price. You're getting $23 or $24, whereas Western Canadian Select oil, which is typically bitumen mixed with diluent, is worth $5 or less. So it's a huge difference. So there is an advantage to finding a way to upgrade to some degree, but it's also true that it's hugely expensive to build a refinery. We've got one being built in Alberta right now that has faced cost overruns, and it just typically they're not economic. So this is why the private sector is shied away from building them. You get in this case, the one in Alberta, you've got some government support for it dating back a number of years, but it's still struggling to get built. So that is the answer in normal times. Will this change things? Possibly, but we still need pipeline capacity to get that product out. Right now, we can't even move some of this refined and upgraded oil that we're producing, simply because there aren't enough rail cars and there aren't enough pipelines to get it out.
I want to shift gears a little bit, but stick with you on this, Monty. I mean, one of the things in response to the Russian Saudi Arabia price war was a proposition that Jason Kenney floated out there, that really to protect ourselves from these kind of global shocks, we have to really start thinking about a continental market, a market that mirrors our NAFTA relations with the United States and Mexico. Since then, we've heard crickets, nothing. Is there no interest in this idea at all?
Well, it's hard to say. I think the Premier was playing to the idea that, OPEC has started this. Saudi Arabia and Russia aren't exactly popular countries, I'll say, in Canada probably these days. And it makes a lot of sense from an Alberta perspective to, explore the idea of whether or not there's an appetite to sell Canadian oil and gas within a North American market. Right now we're close to balance in North America in terms of the overall production, the amount of production that what we produce compared to what we consume. So it's pretty close. Whether or not it's feasible, I don't know, but the Premier was working the phones, talking to governors, talking to senators and congressmen about whether or not there was an interest in that. We haven't heard much since then, but we may yet hear from him and from others on that as we watch this crisis sort of unfold. We're a long ways away from seeing it end, and at some point, people in Texas and Oklahoma, Louisiana, Pennsylvania, et cetera, places that produce a lot of oil and gas, are going to start to say, this isn't working for us either, and we need to have some alternatives.
I think
Sarah, you want to let me get jumped into Sarah, because I'd like her to add to that, and particularly how the U.S. political dynamic that's at work right now might affect Canada's fortunes.
Well, and I think I need to go back again a bit on this, because, sometimes I think that when the provinces and when the Canadian government think about engaging with the United States, they think that they should show up at the White House or they should show up in Washington. And the answer really is, especially on an issue like this, And we've kind of had this conversation during the NAFTA time on the same kind of charm offensive is go to the governors, go to the states, go to the local businesses and the local owners to have this conversation, which I think is what the premier is finally doing. And so, but the other part of it is this is going to take a while. You have to get governors from different states, different political leanings, and you have to get them all kind of headed in the same direction. So it's going to take time, but I do think that there is a real good opportunity here, you know, especially in alignment with states like Texas, states like North Dakota, like South Dakota, Wyoming, Colorado. There are all sorts of opportunities here, especially with some of the refining states as well, like Ohio.
What might that look like if there was a closer relationship?
Well, I think what it should look like is there should be North American governors and premiers that are all invested in the oil. The oil industry, to some extent, should have some sort of a coalition where they're sitting down and they're meeting and they're coming up with a plan that they take to the federal governments on both sides of the border. And so, you know, it's almost a grassroots approach. And I think that is something that has, you know, real opportunity in it. But if they start at the top and try to work their way down, they're going to stall out because the political dynamic, especially in election year, people aren't thinking about this in Washington. They're thinking about how to make America great again.
I think
we'll get more to that too. Sorry, Rick, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
It's important that we understand our economic history and our political history on this score. You know, it's 50 years since we've started talking about and really been practicing the idea of an integrated North American energy economy for oil, for natural gas, and for electricity. And there's vast amounts of all three of those products, commodities, moving back and forth across our borders. And that's provided us with a certain degree of energy independence and energy security that's really quite special in today's world. And you know that in the States, President Obama, even though he was beseeched by many of his supporters to put an end to fracking and shale gas development and so on, instead doubled U.S. Oil production during his 8 years as president, oversaw the doubling of production, which is a challenge for Canada, but in terms of that being also our biggest market. But in the process of doing that, in the process of us increasing our capacity to produce oil in Canada and the Americans producing their capacity to produce oil, we've created this balance that Monty and others are talking about here. We produce about 22 million barrels a day of oil in North America and used only slightly more than that. So we actually don't need to be subject to whatever OPEC wants to be doing with oil production. Sarah's right, it's not all the same product and there's a bit of a mismatch about certain things. So you would export some and import others, but the net of that is that we can insulate ourselves from these price wars that are occurring and have been occurring for the last, well, off and on over decades, but for the last 6 years in an especially intense way. We can protect ourselves. And I think that's a very important idea that we start talking about. One of the specific things that Russia is targeting is basically the destruction of the American shale industry. They understand the other side of that coin, that what's a benefit to America, which is to have energy self-sufficiency, is not a benefit to its adversaries or to its competitors, if you want to use that kind of language. And they'd like to see, by crippling those companies, they'd like to see them remove their production from the equation, because a lot of the shale companies are highly over-leveraged and were expected to be victims of that price war.
I want to get there too in terms of potential American response. But first, Marla, I want to go to you, because I mean, as long as anyone who's been following this file has been following it, we know that the continuing lament of the Alberta government and the oil industry specifically is that there's a regulatory regime around natural resource development that makes moving virtually any new projects almost impossible. What are we likely to see in terms of impact assessment regulation going forward? What kind of changes do you think that we might see as the economy starts to ramp up again?
Yeah, well, certainly the regulatory regime has been an issue of contention over quite a number of years. And this came to a head in 2018, 2019, which which I remember as the year of the bun fight over Bill C-69.
Right.
We were certainly a large part of the buns going back and forth. There were legitimate problems that people brought forward with Bill C-69, but we also need to remember that it was replacing something, SIA 2012, that was also very problematic. It was SIA 2012 that also resulted in these very, very long timelines for review and these court challenges that also had things dragging out for many years after the fact. That was the regime that Northern Gateway came under, Energy East, Trans Mountain, all those things. I think that many people are left with an overwhelmingly negative impression of what Bill C-69 turned into, which is the new Impact Assessment Act. And there's certainly a lot of problems that remain with it. The foremost of one is this idea of political discretion and the idea that the cabinet can and should be making a decision at the very end of the process. There's some reason for hope, though, in that there are certain elements that are going to improve things going forward. Including this new thing that we have, which is an early planning phase, where 6 months into the process, there is a bit of a review of what those potential showstopper issues could be to see if they are going to be sufficiently problematic that it should be stopped now. Something like Northern Gateway would have greatly benefited from that. The fact that it is where it is, and they said you shouldn't have a pipeline in the Great Bear Rainforest, that's not something you need 8 years and $750 million to be able to determine. That's something that you can determine right up front, just knowing the main outlines of the project. So there's reason to hope that some of the machinery will start to unlock with this. I don't think we're in a place where we're going to see changes in the Impact Assessment Act in the next little while. I think what we're more likely to see are the first projects that are going through and see how will they actually perform under the new scheme.
And that's happening now. There are some pilot projects.
There are some pilot projects going forward, and I think that there is reason for the federal government to really want them to go smoothly. I think they want to be able to demonstrate that their new baby works really well. There is one oil and gas project that is of any size. It's out in Saguenay in Quebec, Gazoduc. So I'll be curious to see what happens there. As far as I know, there's no large oil and gas projects out of Alberta that are going through under the scheme yet. So even if it goes very smoothly for Gazoduc, whether that translates to Alberta later remains to be seen.
Interesting. Kaveri, I noticed that now we're starting to get a buildup of questions for the panel. Anything there that you want to ask?
Yeah, there's one here. Does the current economic uncertainty or situation impact the continuation of building the Trans Mountain pipeline?
Who wants to handle Trans Mountain?
Well, there's two ways it has an impact. Like everything else, it's impeding work conditions. Social distancing affects those construction work sites like anything else, like any other part of the economy. That's an essential project, but it's operating under those constraints. On the other side, it's the number one ask of the provincial government in Alberta to accelerate the construction and get it done faster, because to address all the problems that Monty's talking about, the ability to ship oil.
I think if I can, Alan, construction has been underway in northern Alberta, and I think the contractors were awaiting the Canadian Energy Regulator to identify the exact route in the lower mainland of BC so they could eventually get to work on that as well.
Really interesting poll that CBC Alberta put out this morning. In fact, it was part of a larger poll that they've been unraveling over the last week, and it basically asked people in Alberta whether they wanted to see a pivot towards renewables, whether they wanted to see a pivot away from traditional fossil fuel. Results were basically only 16% of the Alberta population wanted to see no pivot towards renewal and a continuing focus on fossil fuel. 31 wanted to see the best of both. They wanted to see more emphasis on renewals, but also continued reliance on fossil fuel. But the single largest group, 48% of Albertans, said they want to see more emphasis on renewals and less reliance on traditional fossil fuel. I mean, what do you make of this poll and sentiment in Alberta? Is the public ahead of the government on this issue? Marla, you got any sense of that?
It was a really interesting poll to me. To a certain extent, in my mind, I think it sets up a bit of a false dichotomy because it's not renewables versus oil and gas necessarily. They're used for different things. Renewables are something that we use domestically for our own energy production. For example, for electricity production, for lighting our now non-used commercial buildings and our homes. So much of our fossil fuel production is an export commodity. It's going elsewhere. So to set this up as, would you prefer to have for you renewables or oil and gas, isn't really how it's going to operate in the real world.
Pollster asked a bad question. Little bit. No, that's a very, very important point. And then, in fact, Monty, in conversations you and I have had, you've made a similar kind of point that it isn't either or, and that in fact, Alberta, in many respects, is a leader in kind of clean energy and renewables.
Yeah, far from the political discussion in the real economy, companies and individuals have been moving to transition oil and gas for a long time. A generation ago, a third of the Alberta economy was oil and gas. Today, it's 25%. Some of the biggest leaders in clean energy production are oil and gas companies. They own wind farms, they own solar farms, et cetera. Some of the big pipeline companies, for instance. One of the biggest solar farm in Canada is slated to be built in southern Alberta starting this summer. So, this is already ongoing. And I think the poll only captures it does capture some public opinion, but doesn't capture the reality of what's going on the ground. And
Rick, you work with. Sorry, Marty, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think it falls to Alberta to do a much better job of talking about some of these things, and clearly this will be a message for the Alberta government.
In fact, Rick, you work with a lot of clients who are major oil and gas producers who also have made huge investments in renewables.
Renewables and clean tech, clean energy in general. We got an LNG project in Canada, a big one, it's one of our clients, who are also using electricity as one of the inputs to the liquefaction process to alleviate the emissions that are associated with producing LNG. That LNG is destined to go to India and other countries in Asia, where it will replace more emissions intense, diesel fuel and so on. So the net of the things that are going on with Canadian oil and gas, when we lighten up emissions load for the production of Canadian oil, downstream the users who are using it are also having their emissions reduced. So there's a verticality in terms of the integration of energy sources and energy technology here that's very important. 200 million of Canada's 700 megatons of carbon emissions, GHG emissions, something around 200 megatons a year are from the oil, are associated with the upstream oil and gas production. And if we can lighten the emissions load associated with that, which we do by the barrel, it's about 35% better than it was 15 years ago. If we can continue doing that, it's making a huge contribution, not only in our own, to our own economy and our own environment in Canada, but to the planet.
I want to go back to part of the conversation we had earlier about the relief package that was going to come within hours, if not days, or days, if not hours, 3 weeks ago, on the assumption that it is going to come at some time. Previous to the outbreak of COVID-19, that the Alberta government was more or less at war with Ottawa. We've seen a much more tempered kind of outlook over the last month and a half. How is this whole issue going to impact federal-provincial relations and in Alberta federal-provincial relations in particular going forward, depending on what kind of package is put forward? I asked that to the entire group. Anyone got a view on that? Little crystal ball gazing?
Well, I will say that if the package turns out to be a good faith attempt to revitalize the industry, then it will undoubtedly make relations with Ottawa a lot warmer from the Alberta perspective. After going up to the tech decision in February to withdraw their proposal to proceed with the tech mine, that was just sort of more fuel on the fire to think that Ottawa was out to get Alberta. If there is an attempt to really revitalize the industry, not just put it on life support, and to build Trans Mountain Pipeline, I think Minister Freeland could take great credit for accomplishing something that I think a lot of people would have thought would have been near impossible right after the election, which is to warm those relations with Ottawa. But it really depends on the quality of the package.
Well, I don't want to be provocative simply for the sake of being provocative, but I mean, listening to you, listening to Rick, I mean, at bottom, the root cause of the problem here right now, it seems to me, is that production just so outstrips demand that getting that balance is virtually impossible. With oil sand product at $6 a barrel, what happens if Ottawa says, you know what, big parts of this industry are just a dodo bird. We're way better off building a high-speed train between Edmonton and Calgary to get the economy going and to invest in new technologies and manufacturing. What would that do to federal-provincial relations, Rick?
Well, I think we need to be smart about the situation we're in. Quite apart from what the normal supply and demand are, the 100 million barrels a day on both sides of that equation for oil, we're in a different universe here. And I think regardless of what the numbers are, the production volumes, I think our goal should be as a country, and for the oil and gas sector and energy sectors in general, is to come out to do as much as we can to come out with a stronger position, a more competitive position, healthier companies, healthier industries, including on the emissions front. If we're going to contract production in any industry, we should be careful to do it in a way that's not just random, that's not just a function of who has the most debt and therefore gets into the most trouble during what's obviously a very deep recession, and hopefully not a very long one, and it could obviously get worse. Some companies are going to become highly distressed and probably fail in the middle of that. Do we use our resources to have them all succeed? This applies to oil and gas, but other sectors as well. Or do we take a less healthy company and a more healthy company and try to combine them so that what emerges is a stronger entity at the end of the day with a better balance sheet, both in terms of dollars and cents, but also in terms of what it's actually doing. There's all kinds of different production in most industries. Some of it's more efficient, including oil. Some of it's more efficient, some of it's more expensive than others, and some of it's more emissions intense. To the extent that we're going to choose amongst these things over the course of the next several months, who knows how long this crisis is going to go on, we should be thinking through some of those equations. Now, if the market's going to take care of things on its own, fine. That's a solution, and I think it's one that we should not interfere much with. But to the extent that governments need to come to the table and help engineer solutions with public money, we should be looking for enhanced competitiveness, which may go to the production levels, and also some of the other characteristics, such as lower emission products should be protected versus higher emission products.
Marla, we touched on this right off the top, but I wanted to leave the most intractable of all the problems towards the end. And that is that, I mean, there's no question a significant barrier to resource development in this country has been the ambiguity around what constitutes consultation and consent with Canada's Indigenous people. What part of reconciliation are we missing here, and what has to happen to ensure that that stalemate doesn't continue forever? You're on mute again, Marla.
Sorry about that. There's noise in the background. It is most definitely an intractable question, and it's one that has a lot of facets because there is no the Indigenous people. There are hundreds and hundreds of different communities, each of whom have many different people with different opinions. Some groups, we have to remember, are also themselves energy producers. They're in the oil and gas business, so there's no singular view. I think what's ambiguous here is not so much the right to be consulted, but a changing target in terms of what constitutes adequate consultation or what constitutes consent. Over the last few years, we've seen a number of court challenges arise Most people probably remember the sequence of them that happened with Trans Mountain, but they arose across a number of different projects. But what happened as a result of that is a body of jurisprudence was built up that said, this is appropriate, this is adequate in terms of what is appropriate consultation, how preferences of different Indigenous groups need to be taken into account, and what doesn't need to be taken into account when you're giving that final project approval. The layer of uncertainty that's now been added newly is something called UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It is something that was built into the preamble of the new Impact Assessment Act, and it refers to this new concept called free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC. That's not something that is in Canadian law, unlike duty to consult, which is enshrined in the Constitution.
So we have no body of jurisprudence or precedent.
We don't know what it means, and we don't.
Do we have to go through the courts again to get there?
We probably are, because the question is, does it constitute a veto or does it not? The government has said it doesn't, but some people are interpreting that it might. And so I think that is throwing, again, ambiguity into the mix that's going to take some years to shake out.
Why would we do that? Why would we do that? I mean, that's what we've done in so many things. We've just, left it to the courts to decide things. That's the abortion issue. That's so much of Indigenous relations, because governments are, I think, generally not brave enough to take the bull by the horns and say, well, here's what we think the framework should be. Here's how we think that should be approached. Here's what we think a sensible approach to consultation and accommodation and consent look like. And, not do that in isolation of talking to Indigenous peoples about that, obviously, but to try to come up with something that's a legislative framework that still people can take to court and challenge. And maybe the courts will say, no, that's not good enough. But shouldn't we at least try to do that? I mean, I think that UNDRIP is an opportunity for us to sit down and say to First Nations, how do we do this? We want to embrace the spirit of this thing. We want to embrace not just the spirit of it, but what we think it means. So what does consent mean? Does that mean every single person needs to consent? Does that mean most people need to consent? Does that mean every First Nation that's affected by a project needs to consent, or most of them? What do we mean by that? Because if the courts have said, if nobody has a veto, if we get into a situation where everybody needs to agree to something, we're basically going to end up doing very few things. And that doesn't serve Indigenous interests. It doesn't serve Canada as a whole. So
as I said, it's the most intractable of all the problems, and we could go on forever on this. But I want to, we're getting very close to the end. The tyranny of time is almost upon us. But Sarah, you mentioned the obvious, is that we're in an election year in America where the focus is on making America great again. While there is a difference in the product mix between the Canadian oil industry and the American oil industry, they have an industry. The extent to which their industry is under any kind of threat. I mean, could we see in the foreseeable future any kind of retaliatory measures in terms of tariffs or import restrictions against the Canadian industry for political gain?
And Alan, I'm going to actually jump in here, Sarah, because there's an interesting question also, if you can try to
better than mine.
Is what might Donald Trump and his potential re-election mean for our energy sector?
There you go.
Okay, so there's two questions there. One being that, and so the 232 national security tariffs, I think I don't think that it would be something that the Trump administration would levy against Canada specifically, but is it something that could rear its head if Russian and Saudi Arabian oil production and the OPEC deal isn't sufficient enough to create a workable environment for American producers? I think absolutely. It's something that he's shown with automakers, and he's shown with a number of other sectors. But he's also shown the willingness to back off when it's been just Canada. Not too long ago, we had the threat of 232s against uranium. And in the end of the day, he walked back from leveling those, even though the report that came out of Commerce indicated that there would be an argument for 232 tariffs on uranium. So I don't think there's a desire to come after Canada specifically, but I do think that Canada is at risk should the price of oil create a more dire situation for American producers that the Trump administration decides to take action on. The other question, I think, obviously, is in an election year, and I have been fairly consistent since the 2016 election that I thought that this president was most likely a two-term president. In the last few weeks, I would say there's a shift in energy in the United States. But that said, watching the protests in some of those key Midwestern states that the president won in 2016, there's still a lot of support for the president in these key areas of the United States. So I think that there's a 50-50 chance right now of what kind of administration that you've got in the United States after November. We have to remember that in general, Republicans are better for Canada than Democrats.
Historically, certainly, yes.
Historically, yeah, absolutely. And so the question, I think, will be, what would a Biden administration do on carbon emissions? And there's one issue in particularly that crosses the aisle for both Republicans and Democrats, and that is some sort of border adjustment tax that would be addressed on carbon products and carbon intensive products. And so should that be something that either Republicans or Democrats look at as some way to assert American national interests, that would be something that would put Canada at risk again. So I think there are numbers of certain areas where there is significant risk for Canada in dealing with the United States. But overall, I think this is part of a broader discussion and between neighbors and allies and partners that most of this would, probably create levels of stress at different periods of time, much like the 232s on steel and aluminum did, but would probably, after a period of time, get worked out regardless of administration.
It is 3 p.m. Mountain Time right now, so I'm going to wrap up. Before we do, just any final thoughts from each of you. Kaveri first.
Yeah, I mean, my final thoughts, I think, would be that, the oil and gas industry, it's not a Western problem. This is a Canadian problem. And, I think we got to start the conversation that way. Rick said it early on. It employs over 800,000 people directly or indirectly. So the recovery for this industry is a recovery for Canada.
Rick, you're on mute, but once you come off, last thoughts?
I'm going to quote Rahm Emanuel, the former chief of staff to Barack Obama,
Mayor of Chicago.
Yep. Never let a crisis go to waste. We didn't choose to be in this situation. None of us would have wanted it, but here we are. And some extraordinary things are going to have to get done by governments, by all of us, by companies, by workers, by healthcare workers, by the whole of society, essentially, to get through this. And we can either just let nature take its course, which would be highly destructive on the health side. And same thing if we just let that happen on the economic side. If we're smart about what happens here, we can address some things that need to be addressed. Hopefully bring people together and emerge with more competitive companies and more competitive industries and cleaner as well. And I hope that part of that is the discussion that we were talking about with Indigenous Canadians, but that's always the hardest part of this because it's the freest form.
Marla?
We're living in an unprecedented time, and I find it absolutely fascinating. One of the things that I've enjoyed is after a couple of years where partisan and polarization was just ramping itself up until it was the loudest thing in the room, we've had a couple of weeks of breathing space from that, which I've really enjoyed. At the same time, I think that we're in a circumstance right now that is just going to accelerate the trends that we've seen before in terms of shifting values, shifting transitions. I think over the next few weeks and months, we're going to see a ramping up of the desire for an accelerated change.
Sarah, thoughts?
I think that's true, and I think that coming out on the other side of this, we're going to have an economy that looks much different than the one that we came into this crisis with. And I think there are real opportunities in that, but I think we also need to be pretty honest. And I think that lawmakers and policymakers need to be a little bit more honest with Canadians and in the US as well about, you know, who survives, what kind of businesses survive, and what kind of, you know, what does a new industry on the other side of this look like? And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity, and Rick talked about a lot of the, you know, kind of bringing out the best of two companies, taking companies that are weaker and allowing them to succeed by being part of a larger, stronger company, or even a smaller, stronger company. That's going to have to really come into the equation, because we are looking at a significant transition on the other side of this.
Last word to you, Monty.
Well, thank you, Alan. Worldwide oil and gas demand continues to grow. Lots of industries were crushed by the global government shutdown, including the oil and gas sector. They need some support to get us through this, but I'm confident that the Canadian oil and gas industry can continue to prosper, create jobs, be our biggest exporter for some time to come. That's not to say there isn't a transition ongoing. There is. And the good news is the industry itself is playing a very large part in helping make it happen. So I think the future can be very bright if governments step up and make the right decisions.
I want to thank the panelists, each and every one, for a great conversation. Really, really interesting. It's always great to learn something. And to all the people who participated through the webinar, if you want to follow up with any of the individuals that are here, virtually all of our emails are our first name at earnscliffe.ca, or you can find us on the www.earnscliffeca website. Monty, are you on that website too? Monty's a partner of
No,
ours.
I haven't won that great honor yet.
You haven't, on New West Public
New
Affairs
West, yes,
in
right.
in the province. But with that, I close off our proceedings and wish you all just to be safe. Thank you very much.